Hey folks, welcome back. Chapter 2, Section 2. We are looking at the diversity of deviance. So when we think of deviance, is it a narrow set of criteria or is it a broad set of criteria? And we have to come back to those questions. Remember how, what, um, when, where, context, the sociological imagination, all the things that we talked about in the first section. We're going to carry that over into this next session, or this next section. So when we're considering deviance, what comes to mind? What do you typically think about? And is that different than what other people think about? When most people think about deviance, we tend to think about or reflect on criminal forms of deviance, well, drug abuse, drug use, drug dealing, things like assault, robbery, rape, murder. But crime is only one form of deviance. There's all kinds of other types of deviance. Deviance is a difference from the norm. So if heterosexuality is the norm and homosexuality is the deviant behavior, that doesn't mean that homosexuality is illegal. It just means that it's different than what the society as a whole accepts as normal behavior. And that's where values and judgments start to come in, and that's where I start to get a little uncomfortable because constructing behavior as deviant generally leads to stigmatization and all kinds of other adverse impacts and effects on those that are labeled deviant. Some examples that were studied in the past: disabled and or mentally ill populations. Whether we like to admit it or not, if you have a disability, the way society, the able-bodied people construct you is as deviant. We might say that that's not how we do it. We certainly treat people that do not have all of their capacities in a different way than those that do. Voluntarily childless people. If you choose to go through life not having any children, historically, this is becoming less of a stigma today, but historically it was certainly seen as abnormal and deviant. Homelessness, of course, being without a place to stay in the United States is in many places criminal, but it's certainly construed as being deviant or exhibiting deviant behavior. Topless dancers, of course, bisexuals, anorexics and bulimics, cutters, the self-injurers in society, and gay male Christian couples, gay males or gay couples as a whole, and gay male Christian couples in particular. Some other forms. This particular list reflects a study that was done in 1965. People were asked which groups might still be considered deviant, which might no longer be viewed as deviant, which would you suspect the percentages and ratings for groups as deviant. Why would these categories change over time? So when you think about these, this is a list from 1965. How would this be different today? Homosexuals, drug addicts, alcoholics, prostitutes, murderers, criminals, lesbians, juvenile delinquents, beatniks, mentally ill, perverts, communists, atheists, and political extremists. How do you think those would have changed over time? Have they changed? Some things that we need to think about in reference to whether we conform and whether conformity can be seen and construed as deviance in and of itself. There was an example in the book that was talking about strict conformity and how that could lead to adverse effects. There's a video they talk about called 55, where a group of people drive the speed limit on the highway across multiple lanes, and the adverse effects that take shape because of it, including acts of road rage. So is adhering, so the question is adhering to the norm, or in this case, it could be the legal limit, actually a deviant act? So are the students deviant, or are the students deviant if they're driving 55, or are the other drivers deviant because they are acting out because they're being inconvenienced by people that are driving the legal speed limit? As you think about these things, I always ask you, can you think of other examples where strict conformity might be construed as deviant behavior? Deviant behavior can be seen in reference to categories. Physical deviance is the first category that we come across in the book. What we're talking about here is deviance and appearance. Some forms of visible types of deviance. Well, the aesthetic norms, breaking the aesthetic norms, or when we ask what should people look like according to the norms of height, weight, and the absence or presence of disfigurement. So many people take it upon themselves to push those aesthetic norms and to modify their bodies, or to gain more weight, or to lose weight. And then, of course, physical incapacity, which would include those with a physical disability. The physical incapacity is less of a choice, whereas challenging aesthetic norms can actually be somewhat of a choice. This, of course, results in stereotypes, stigmas, and other serious consequences in reference to exclusion. There's an example of a person putting out an ad on something like Match.com saying, "Miss Lonely Hearts, good dancer, has nice shape and pretty clothes, but no nose." You can imagine that the absence of a nose could create adverse responses from those who possess noses. And in this letter from Miss Lonely Hearts, she argues that the consequences of this reality have created depression and loneliness to such a degree that she's considered suicide. This makes us question what the acceptable norms of physical appearance are, and how they vary widely depending on the social context. When we think about the ideal body types for women, well, we think about them, and if we think about them over time, we see that they have changed over time. In the 1950s, the ideal woman was a much larger woman than the ideal woman that we see presented in the media today. Marilyn Monroe, Jane Mansfield, and those women in movies and TV shows in the past were bigger boned, much larger women, and that seems to have changed over time. and by the 1990s and the early 2000s, women have become so thin in the presentation of the ideal woman that it is creating eating disorders like anorexia and bulimia to try and meet up to this impossible standard. Body modification is another form of physical deviance. Tattoos, piercings, reconstructive surgery. There's a video in this section that deals with this, and then of course demedicalizing of self-injury, which was once viewed as self-mutilation, and now is starting to be considered a personal expression, a coping mechanism to stress and other things. It doesn't create any real adverse problems for the person that's doing the cutting, and it may actually serve as a pressure valve to deal with things that the individual might not be able to deal with. It's not me saying that. That's just where the field's going and how we understand and how we are moving that that expression from being an expression of deviant behavior to something that may be a little more positive for the individual. Of course, we always come back to deviance in pop culture. There's all kinds of deviance portrayed in pop culture. These provide examples of cultural norms, deviant behavior, and coping with the stigma. Some movies like The Wolf of Wall Street and Black Swan, and television shows like The Little Couple and My Strange Addiction are showing how those that are ostracized and excluded from society are coping with that. And now this comes back to that reality TV being somewhat of an abstract or an alternative view of reality, but it still gives us an insight into what it feels like to be ostracized and be constructed as deviant. Relationships and deviance tend at times go hand in hand. Sexual orientation is one of the major categories for the construction of the other as a deviant. Heterosexuality in our society is the norm, so anyone that is expressing themselves in any other way than heterosexuality tends to be defined as deviant. Now, I'm not saying they're deviant. It just, it's other than the norm, and in this particular society, the norm is heterosexuality. But in reference to this, we've made significant strides in acceptance of people that are not heterosexuals. We've made significant steps in allowing homosexuals to marry, to have legal rights that are afforded to heterosexuals that engage in marriage. Sexual acts, of course, have always been a place where we've rubbed up against deviance, whether it's exotic dancers and strippers, or prostitution, or sex in public restrooms. We have a hang up with sex in our society, and those that are willing to explore outside of the norms of society are certainly considered deviant. And then, of course, monogamy is the norm, and anyone engaging in polygamy would be breaking the norm. So the Jeff Jeffords of the world are seen as deviants, and generally society punishes those for violating sexual norms.